The wind cut across the open land like a blade, dragging long trails of snow over the frozen ground. In the distance, the mountains stood tall and white, silent watchers over a land that had seen too many hard winters and too many hard hearts. A narrow path wound through the snow, barely visible beneath drifting powder. Along that lonely path walked a young woman, her shoulders bent under the weight of heavy sacks tied with rough rope. Each step she took sank deep into the snow. Her boots were worn thin, her coat patched many times, and frost clung to the ends of her dark braids. Still, she kept moving. The bags she carried were nearly as heavy as she was, but she did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaining only made people look at her with the same tired eyes. Behind her, several paces away, a cowboy walked beside a gray horse. His hat was pulled low against the cold wind. The horse's breath came out in clouds as it stepped carefully through the snow. The cowboy had been quiet the entire journey. He watched the young woman ahead of him, the way she struggled yet refused to stop. The way she kept her head down but never slowed. The townsfolk had warned him about her. They said she was foolish. They said she was slow in the head. They said her own father could not stand her. The cowboy was not sure he believed any of it. A few days earlier, the girl's father had stood in front of the saloon with his arms crossed and his face red with drink and anger. He had spoken loudly so everyone could hear. "Take her," he had said to the cowboy. "Take the girl and keep her out there on your land. She ain't good for nothing here." Some men had laughed. Others had simply looked away. The girl had been standing a few steps behind her father, holding a small cloth bag with everything she owned. She had not cried, she had not argued. She had simply waited like someone who had already accepted what was coming. Her father had called her stupid more times than anyone could count. The word had followed her through the town like a shadow. Stupid girl. Slow girl, useless girl. But the cowboy remembered something strange from that moment. While the father shouted and cursed, the girl had quietly helped an old man who slipped on the icy street. She had lifted him carefully, brushed the snow from his coat, and handed him back his dropped cane without saying a word. Nobody else had moved to help, not even her father. That small moment had stayed in the cowboy's mind. Now, as the wind howled across the valley, he watched her again. Her steps were slow, but they were steady. Most people would have asked to ride the horse by now. Most people would have begged for rest. She had not asked for anything. After nearly an hour of walking, she finally stopped. Not because she was tired. The cowboy noticed her head tilt slightly as if she were listening. The land around them was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. The girl slowly lowered the heavy sacks onto the snow and turned her head toward the mountains. Her eyes scanned the distant hills in a way that made the cowboy uneasy. "You hear something?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Her fingers brushed lightly against the snow, feeling its surface. Then she looked at the horse, studying the way its ears twitched and its body shifted nervously. Finally, she spoke. "Storm coming," she said softly. The cowboy glanced up at the sky. It was pale and cold, but nothing looked unusual. "I don't see any storm," the girl shook her head slowly. "Not sky storm," she pointed toward the mountains. For a moment the cowboy saw nothing. Just white slopes and dark rock. Then he noticed it, a faint rumble far away. It was deep and low, like the land itself was groaning. The girl quickly grabbed the sacks again and began walking faster down the path. The cowboy frowned. "Hey, slow down." But she did not slow down. The rumble grew louder. Snow began sliding in thin streams down one of the distant slopes. The cowboy's stomach tightened. Avalanche. He turned his horse quickly and followed after the girl, who was now moving faster than he had thought possible. Her steps were careful but urgent, as if she knew exactly how much time they had. The ground trembled again. The cowboy looked back just as a massive wall of snow broke free from the mountainside. It thundered downward like a roaring white river. His horse panicked. "Move!" he shouted. The girl suddenly stopped and turned toward a cluster of rocks near the path. She dropped the sacks and began clearing snow away with her hands. "What are you doing?" the cowboy yelled. But she kept digging. Within seconds she revealed a narrow hollow between the rocks, just large enough for two people and the horse's head. She motioned urgently. The cowboy hesitated only a moment before pulling the horse toward the opening. The roar behind them grew louder. Snow rushed down the mountain with terrifying speed. They barely squeezed into the rocky hollow before the avalanche slammed across the valley. For a long time, all they could hear was thunder and the grinding weight of snow burying the land. When the sound finally faded, the valley looked completely different. The path they had been walking on was gone, buried. The cowboy slowly turned toward the girl. She was brushing snow from her hands, breathing hard but calm. "You knew that was coming," he said quietly. She did not answer. Instead, she lifted one of the heavy sacks again and stepped back onto the snow. The cowboy watched her carefully now. All those people in town had called her stupid. But the longer he traveled with her, the more he began to wonder something else. What if they had been wrong all along? What if the girl her father had thrown away understood this land better than anyone else? And if that was true, then the man who had sent her away might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. But neither of them knew yet that someone else had been watching from the ridge above. And that person had no intention of letting them leave the mountains alive. The cowboy did not notice the watcher on the ridge. His attention was on the young woman walking ahead of him through the deep snow. The avalanche had erased the path they were following, leaving only a wide white valley that looked unfamiliar and dangerous. Snowdrifts rose like small hills, and broken branches poked out from the frozen ground where the rushing snow had passed. The girl moved carefully, scanning the land as if reading a book written in tracks and shadows. The heavy sacks were once again on her shoulders. The cowboy had offered to carry one, but she shook her head and kept walking. The horse followed behind them, still nervous from the thunder of the avalanche. For a while, neither of them spoke. The cold air burned in their lungs as they moved forward. Finally, the cowboy broke the silence. "You saved us back there." The girl did not turn around. She simply kept walking. He was not used to people ignoring him. In most towns across the Western Territories, cowboys were respected. Sometimes feared, sometimes welcomed with drinks and stories. But this girl treated him like he was just another traveler on the road. "You knew where that shelter was," he continued. "How?" This time she slowed her steps slightly. "Old place," she said quietly. "My people used rocks like that when storms came." The cowboy studied her for a moment. Most folks in town had barely bothered to learn anything about her. They only repeated the same word again and again. Stupid. Yet the more time he spent near her, the less that word made sense. They walked for another half hour before the wind began to rise again. Thin snow blew across the valley floor, making it harder to see where they were stepping. In the distance, a thin line of dark trees stretched along the edge of a frozen creek. The girl pointed toward them. "We go there," the cowboy nodded. Trees meant shelter, firewood, maybe even animals passing through. But as they moved closer, he noticed something strange. The girl's pace slowed. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. The cowboy stepped beside her. "What is it?" She pointed toward the snow ahead. At first he saw nothing but a flat white surface. Then his eyes adjusted. Tracks, fresh ones. Boot prints. The cowboy crouched down and studied them carefully. They were not theirs. Someone had passed through the valley not long ago. The prints were deep and wide, made by heavy boots. Whoever had left them had been walking alone. The tracks came down from the direction of the ridge, the same ridge where the silent watcher had stood earlier. The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Looks like we ain't the only ones out here." The girl stared at the prints without speaking. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. After a moment, she stepped around the tracks and continued toward the trees. The cowboy followed, but his hand rested near the handle of the knife at his belt. Out in these parts, strangers in the mountains could mean trouble. The trees offered some protection from the wind. Snow gathered in thick piles around the trunks, but the ground beneath the branches was easier to walk on. The girl finally set her sacks down beside a fallen log. The cowboy tied the horse to a low branch and began gathering dry twigs for a fire. For several minutes they worked quietly. The sound of snapping sticks echoed softly between the trees. The cowboy struck a match, and soon a small flame flickered to life, pushing away a bit of the cold. As the fire grew, the girl opened one of her sacks. Inside were dried herbs, small bundles of food, and pieces of cloth wrapped carefully together. She handed the cowboy a strip of dried meat. He accepted it with a nod. They sat across from each other with the fire between them. For the first time since leaving town, the cowboy had a good look at her face in the firelight. She looked younger than he first thought. Maybe not much older than a teenager. But her eyes held something older than that. They carried the kind of quiet that comes from surviving hard years. "What did your father mean?" the cowboy asked slowly. "When he said you were no good for anything?" The girl stared at the fire. For a moment it seemed like she would not answer. Then she spoke in a calm voice. "He says I think wrong." The cowboy waited. "In town they say things one way," she continued. "I say things another way. People get angry when they don't understand." She picked up a small stick and pushed the firewood gently. "My father says if I don't speak like them, I must be stupid." The cowboy frowned. He had seen plenty of people in his life who liked to judge others quickly. Still, something about the story bothered him. "You don't seem stupid to me." She did not react to the compliment. Instead, she turned her head toward the trees. Her eyes narrowed. The cowboy noticed the change immediately. "What now?" She did not answer right away. Then she whispered one word. "Listen." The cowboy held his breath. At first he heard only the crackling of the fire. Then another sound reached his ears. A soft crunch, snow shifting under a boot. The sound came from somewhere beyond the trees. The cowboy slowly reached for the knife at his belt. The horse lifted its head and snorted nervously. Another step echoed through the forest. Someone was out there, watching them. The girl rose slowly to her feet, her movements calm but alert. The cowboy stood as well. Neither of them spoke. The trees ahead remained still, their branches heavy with snow. But the cowboy could feel it in his gut. They were no longer alone. And whoever had followed those tracks into the valley had finally decided to step closer. The sound in the trees stopped. For a long moment nothing moved except the thin smoke rising from the small fire. The cowboy held his knife low at his side, his eyes searching the shadows between the trunks. Snow hung from the branches like frozen curtains, making it hard to see very far. The girl stood beside the fallen log, still and quiet. She did not look frightened. Instead, she seemed to be studying the forest the same way she had studied the mountains earlier. The cowboy spoke first, his voice firm but not loud. "Whoever you are, you might as well step out." No answer came. The horse shifted its weight and snorted again, its ears pointed toward the deeper part of the woods. Then another step broke the silence. A figure slowly emerged from behind a wide pine tree. It was a man wrapped in a heavy coat lined with fur. Snow clung to his boots and shoulders. His beard was thick and dark, and his eyes moved carefully between the cowboy, the girl, and the horse. He kept both hands visible, though they looked rough and strong enough to handle trouble if needed. The cowboy did not lower his knife. "You been following us?" he asked. The stranger shrugged slightly. "Following the valley," the man replied. His voice was deep and slow. "Hard not to notice an avalanche like that?" The girl watched the man closely but said nothing. The cowboy studied the stranger's boots. They matched the tracks they had found earlier in the snow. "You traveling alone?" the cowboy asked. The man nodded. "For now." The answer did not make the cowboy feel any better. The stranger took a cautious step closer to the fire but stopped several feet away. "You planning to stab every traveler you meet out here?" the man said with a faint smile. The cowboy did not return the smile. "Depends on the traveler." The man looked at the girl next. His gaze lingered for a moment as if he recognized something about her. "You from the town down the ridge?" he asked her. She gave a small nod. "Thought so," he said quietly. "I passed through there yesterday." The cowboy felt a tight feeling in his chest. Yesterday, that meant this man had been close when the girl's father sent her away. "You hear anything interesting in town?" the cowboy asked. The stranger's eyes flicked toward him again. "Depends what you call interesting." He crouched near the edge of the firelight but still kept his distance. "Whole place was buzzing about a deal," he continued. "Some folks from outside the territory been buying land." "Quiet-like, paying good money," the cowboy frowned. Land deals were not unusual in the West, but quiet ones often meant trouble. "What does that have to do with us?" The stranger glanced again at the girl. "Maybe nothing," he said. "Maybe everything," the girl finally spoke. "What kind of men?" Her voice was calm, but the cowboy could tell she was paying close attention. The stranger rubbed his hands together near the warmth of the fire. Men who look at mountains and see gold under them. Men who think every piece of land should belong to whoever can buy it. The cowboy had heard stories like that before. Railroad companies, mining groups, speculators, they moved through territories quietly at first, buying land from people who did not know its real value. Sometimes they used money, sometimes they used pressure. The stranger continued. I heard talk in the saloon about a rancher who refused to sell his land near the northern ridge. The cowboy felt a strange tension in the air. Why refuse? Because that land sits right over a silver vein, the stranger said. The fire crackled softly. The cowboy glanced at the girl again. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, but he could tell she was listening to every word. And where is this land? The cowboy asked carefully. The stranger pointed vaguely toward the mountains beyond the valley. Up there somewhere. The direction was the same one they were traveling toward. The cowboy's grip tightened slightly on the knife. You planning to find that silver yourself? The man shook his head slowly. I don't dig holes in frozen mountains. Then why are you here? The stranger hesitated. For the first time since he appeared, his expression grew serious. I was hired to watch the trails, he said. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. Watch them for who? The man did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at the girl again. You the rancher's daughter? He asked her. The question hung in the cold air. The girl remained silent. But the cowboy suddenly remembered the shouting in front of the saloon, the angry father. The way the townspeople had whispered, the land he owned. A slow realization crept into the cowboy's mind. You mean her father owns that ridgeland? The stranger gave a small nod. That's what I heard? The cowboy felt a mix of confusion and anger. If the girl's father owned valuable land, why send his daughter away like unwanted baggage? Why call her stupid in front of everyone? The stranger stood up slowly. Men with money want that land, he continued. And when rich men want something, they usually get it. The girl finally lifted her eyes. They think he will sell? The stranger shook his head. No, they think he will disappear. The wind pushed through the trees again, rattling the branches. The cowboy felt the weight of those words settle over the camp like a dark cloud. If someone planned to remove the girl's father, the entire town could be caught in the middle. And somehow this quiet girl had been pushed out of the way just before it happened, as if someone wanted her gone. The stranger stepped back from the fire. I was told to watch the mountain passes, he said. Make sure nobody interferes. The cowboy looked at him sharply. And yet here you are telling us all this. The stranger's face hardened. Because the men who hired me don't know something. What? The man nodded toward the girl. They don't know she understands the mountains better than any of them. The fire crackled louder as a log shifted. The girl slowly stood again, lifting her heavy sack onto her shoulder. The cowboy noticed her eyes scanning the dark forest once more. The stranger followed her gaze. What now? She spoke quietly. More people coming. The cowboy felt his stomach drop. The stranger turned quickly toward the deeper woods. This time the sound was clearer. Several sets of boots moving through snow, not one man. Not two, a group. And they were heading straight toward the small fire glowing beneath the trees. The sound of boots grew clearer between the trees. The cowboy slowly kicked snow over the fire, dimming the bright flames until only a dull red glow remained beneath the ashes. Darkness wrapped around the small camp almost instantly. The wind moved through the branches above, whispering through frozen needles. The girl adjusted the weight of the sack on her shoulder and stepped closer to the cowboy. How many? He whispered. The stranger crouched low and listened carefully. 4, maybe 5. The horse shifted nervously, sensing the tension spreading through the small clearing. The cowboy's mind moved quickly. 5 men in open woods at night rarely meant friendly conversation. And if those men worked for the same wealthy buyers the stranger mentioned, they were likely searching for something or someone. Or both. The girl turned her head slightly, listening again. They are not careful, she said softly. The stranger frowned. What do you mean? They walk heavy, loud. The cowboy understood her meaning. Experienced trackers moved through forests quietly, especially in winter when every step could echo through the snow. These men were not worried about being heard, which meant they believed nobody dangerous was out here. The stranger gave a quiet breath. They must think the avalanche cleared the valley. The cowboy looked toward the direction of the approaching sounds. Then let's keep it that way. The girl stepped toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. This way. The cowboy untied the horse quickly and led it after her. The stranger followed close behind. They moved through thick clusters of pine, careful not to snap branches or kick loose stones. The girl walked first, weaving through narrow spaces between rocks and roots like someone who had memorized the forest long ago. Behind them, the voices of the approaching men finally reached the clearing. Low and rough, one man laughed loudly, another complained about the cold. They had not yet noticed the faint glow of the dying fire. The girl led the small group down a narrow slope that curved toward the frozen creek they had seen earlier. The snow there was thinner beneath the trees, revealing patches of icy ground. She stopped beside a large fallen pine and knelt near the base of its trunk. The cowboy leaned closer. "What is it?" She pointed to a thin line in the snow. Tracks, many tracks, old ones. Animal trails crossing the creek again and again over time. The stranger's eyes widened slightly. "A crossing point." The girl nodded. She then pointed across the frozen water toward a wall of jagged rocks rising on the other side. Between two of those rocks was a narrow gap, barely visible in the darkness. "We go there." The cowboy looked back toward the direction of the clearing. The men's voices were closer now. They had found the campsite. A shout echoed through the trees. The cowboy wasted no time. "Move!" They crossed the frozen creek quickly. The ice creaked under the weight of the horse but held strong. Once on the other side, the girl slipped through the narrow rock gap and motioned for the others to follow. Inside was a small hidden space formed by leaning boulders. Snow barely reached the ground there, and the wind was almost silent. The cowboy pulled the horse inside last. They waited. Moments later, the group of men reached the creek. Their lantern light flickered between the trees, casting long moving shadows across the snow. One man pointed toward the campsite behind them. "They were there," another voice answered. "Tracks lead this way." The cowboy held his breath. The girl watched the men carefully through the narrow opening between the rocks. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were sharp and focused. The stranger leaned close to the cowboy and whispered, "Those are the buyer's men. I recognize two of them. How sure?" "Sure enough." The cowboy studied the figures moving along the creek. They carried rifles and lanterns. Their coats were thick and expensive compared to the rough gear worn by most travelers. These were not wandering hunters, these were hired men. One of them crouched near the edge of the creek and studied the ground. The cowboy felt his pulse rise. If the man noticed the crossing marks on the ice, the hiding place would not stay secret for long. But something else caught the girl's attention. She leaned closer to the narrow gap and stared toward the ridge above the creek. The cowboy followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then a faint shape moved along the ridgeline, another group. More men. These ones carried no lanterns. They moved slowly and carefully. Watching the valley below, the girl whispered, "Scouts," the stranger cursed quietly under his breath. "They brought more than I thought?" Now the cowboy understood the full danger. The men at the creek were only part of the search. Others were surrounding the valley from higher ground. They were closing in. The cowboy looked toward the girl. "What do we do?" She studied the mountains beyond the ridge. Snow clouds gathered along the peaks, dark and heavy. A slow wind began rolling down the slopes. She pointed toward a distant narrow pass that cut between two tall cliffs. "If we reach that pass, we reach the northern ridge." The cowboy knew what that meant. The land her father owned. The land the buyers wanted. The place where everything might finally make sense. But reaching it would mean crossing open ground while armed men searched the valley. The stranger shook his head slowly. "They'll see us." The girl looked again at the gathering clouds. "No." The cowboy followed her gaze. The wind grew stronger. Snow began drifting through the air again. A storm was building over the mountains, the kind that could swallow entire trails and blind anyone caught outside. The girl lifted her sack again. "We go now." Behind them, one of the men at the creek suddenly shouted, "I found tracks." Lantern light swung across the frozen surface. Another man stepped forward, raising his rifle. The cowboy felt the tension snap tight around them. If the men crossed the creek, the hiding place would be exposed within minutes. The stranger gripped his coat. "They're coming," the wind roared louder through the valley. Snow swept down from the peaks like a white curtain. The girl stepped out from the rock shelter first, moving straight toward the dark pass between the cliffs. The cowboy grabbed the horse and followed. Behind them, the first of the armed men stepped onto the ice. And far above on the ridge, the silent scouts began moving down toward the valley floor. The wind hit them the moment they stepped out of the rock shelter. Snow blew across the valley in sharp waves, stinging their faces and blurring the land ahead. The narrow mountain pass between the cliffs looked farther away now, almost swallowed by the growing storm. The girl walked first, her steps steady even as the snow thickened around them. The cowboy held the horse's reins tightly and pushed forward beside the stranger. Behind them, the voices of the armed men echoed faintly through the storm. "They saw us," the stranger said over the rising wind. The cowboy glanced back and caught flashes of lantern light moving across the creek. The men had crossed the ice and were spreading out through the trees, but the storm was beginning to work in their favor. The falling snow thickened by the minute, turning the valley into a white blur. The girl did not look back. She kept moving toward the mountain pass like she knew every rock and slope ahead. "How far?" the cowboy asked. "Not far," she answered. The stranger shook snow from his beard and looked over his shoulder again. "They won't give up easy." That silver vein means too much money, the cowboy thought about the girl's father then. The angry man standing outside the saloon, shouting and pushing his daughter away. At the time it had looked like cruelty. Now it began to feel like something else. Maybe the father had known trouble was coming. Maybe sending his daughter away had been his way of protecting her. The wind roared louder as they reached the base of the cliffs. The pass was narrow, carved through tall rock walls that blocked some of the worst wind. Snow drifted deep along the entrance. The girl slowed and studied the ground. "What is it?" the cowboy asked. "Men passed here before," she said. Fresh tracks cut through the snow, heading up the pass. The stranger leaned down and studied them. 2 men. Maybe scouts from the ridge. The cowboy tightened his grip on the reins. "They might still be up there." The girl nodded once. Then she stepped into the pass. The path twisted upward between the cliffs. The storm grew louder above them, but the high walls blocked the wind enough that they could move faster. Halfway up the pass, a sound stopped them all. A man's voice echoed from above. "Who's there?" The cowboy froze. 2 figures appeared at the top of the narrow path. Both carried rifles. One of them stepped forward, squinting through the blowing snow. Then something unexpected happened. The man lowered his rifle slightly and stared at the girl. "You?" His voice held surprise. The girl stepped forward slowly. The cowboy watched closely, ready to move if things turned bad. The man studied her face for a long moment. Then recognition spread across his expression. "You're his daughter," he said. The stranger muttered quietly. "Looks like word travels fast." The second man raised his rifle again. "Boss said nobody gets through here," but the first man lifted a hand, stopping him. "Hold on." He looked back at the girl again. "Your father sent you away, didn't he?" She nodded. The man let out a breath. "He did the same with the horses yesterday. Sent them north before the buyer's men showed up." The cowboy felt a spark of understanding click into place. The rancher had known something was coming. The man at the top of the pass continued. "Those buyers tried to force him to sell the land. He refused. Said the mountains belonged to the people who lived with them, not to men who wanted to tear them apart." The second man lowered his rifle slowly. "So you came back to help him?" The girl shook her head. "No, I came home." The wind howled through the cliffs again. The first man looked down the pass behind them where faint lantern lights flickered through the storm. "They're chasing you, aren't they?" The cowboy answered this time. "Yes." The man nodded once and turned to his partner. "Then we don't have time to stand here." He stepped aside and waved them up the rest of the pass. "Come on, the ranch is just over the ridge." They climbed the final stretch together. When they reached the top, the storm opened into a wide plateau of snow-covered land. In the distance stood a group of wooden buildings surrounded by fences and barns. The ranch. Warm light glowed through the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. The girl stopped for a moment, staring at the place. The cowboy watched her expression carefully. For the first time since he met her, he saw something different in her eyes. Hope. They walked down toward the ranch quickly. As they approached the house, the front door opened. A tall man stepped out onto the porch. Even through the blowing snow, the cowboy recognized him immediately. The girl's father. He looked older than he had in town, his shoulders heavy from worry and long nights. When his eyes landed on his daughter, he froze. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the girl stepped forward. The father walked slowly down the porch steps until they stood a few feet apart. "I told you to stay away," he said quietly. The girl looked up at him. "You said I was stupid." The man lowered his head. "I said that so they'd believe it." The wind softened for a moment around them. "They were watching the town," he continued. "If they thought you knew anything about the land, they'd come after you too." The girl studied his face. "You sent me away to keep me safe?" The man nodded slowly. Silence filled the snowy yard. Then the girl stepped forward and hugged him. The cowboy and the others stood quietly nearby. After a moment, the father looked toward the cowboy. "You brought her back." The cowboy shrugged lightly. "She mostly led the way," the stranger laughed softly, "and saved our hides more than once." The father looked down at his daughter again. "Your mother always said you could read the land better than anyone." The girl smiled faintly. Behind them, the storm grew stronger over the valley. The buyer's men would not reach the ranch easily now. The mountain paths were already disappearing under fresh snow. Inside the house, warm firelight waited. The cowboy looked out across the snowy ridge one last time. The land was quiet again. The girl, who had once been called stupid, had crossed the mountains, outsmarted dangerous men, and returned home stronger than anyone expected. And for the first time, everyone around her finally understood the truth. She had never been foolish. She had simply seen the world in a way others failed to understand. The mountains knew it. Now the rest of them did too.